Hi everyone! Usually the average Western viewer or listener is very little familiar in detail with the history of Eastern Europe, and especially Kievan Rus. But there is nothing strange about this, since the history of any region is often the most interesting and the most carefully studied by those who care about this region, in our case, Russians and Ukrainians. Which is why the vast majority of videos on English-language YouTube telling about the exceptional continuity of all the Ukraine from Kievan Rus are created by Ukrainians who are trying to make this point of view mainstream in the West.
So when did Ukraine become part of the Western world? Meet Vladimir, Prince of Kiev. When Moscow didn't exist yet, he converted to Christianity and decided we needed to join the European Union.
And the video that we will analyze today is no exception. Let's read what the author writes in the description of his channel. Busting Moscow's myths in bulk or one at a time. Exposing lies about Ukraine. My name's Yaroslav, I'm from Ukraine. Well, that sounds promising. Hello dear viewers, and this video will analyze Yaroslav's historical lies, manipulations and cheap propaganda about the history of Russia and Kievan Rus. At the same time, I won't challenge the rights of Ukraine or Belarus to succession from Rus. I'm just going to destroy this pseudo-historical misunderstanding using facts, arguments, logic and of course historical sources. Enjoy watching. From the very beginning, it's worth noting that Yaroslav refers to extremely biased sources of information. This is Hrushevsky, Dashkevich, unexpectedly Karl Marx, and Team Snyder. Let's figure out who is who.
Ukrainian people became a victim of probably the biggest cultural robbery in human history. Ukraine's most prominent historian, Mikhail Hrushevsky, point-blank said, "We are a nation whose name was stolen."
Hrushevsky was the Ukrainian nationalist and chairman of the Central Rada of the Ukrainian People's Republic. In modern Ukraine, he is revered as one of the architects of the Ukrainian nation. It would be foolish to deny that Hrushevsky was extremely biased in his historical assessments, and his goal was to promote only one narrative. Rus is Ukraine. Even at the dawn of his career, Hrushevsky was invited to debate by historian Linichenko, who was born and raised in Kiev. But Mikhail declined this invitation. Later we will see why Hrushevsky's thesis is untenable, since Yaroslav will very often refer to his arguments in this video.
Moscovia stole the name Russia and got us all fooled. Such a bold claim would require some unwavering evidence, which is exactly what I'm going to do in this video. I will present all evidence required that would support my bold claim for you to have no doubts this is so.
Next, author quotes the words of Karl Marx, who is not an expert in the field of the history of ancient Rus.
And I'll start by teasing you with a quote by Karl Marx, which you probably didn't know he ever said. The origin of Muscovy lies in the bloody degradation of Mongolian slavery, and not in the rude heroism of the Norman epoch. Modern Russia is nothing but a transfigured Muscovy.
One of the main ideologies of communism was an avid Russophobe, despised Russia for its conservatism and based literally his entire vision on Russian history through the writings of the Polish propagandist Pelenski, who spread the conspiracy theory that Russians are not Slavs, which is not confirmed by any modern genetic research. Later, Marx himself, despite his own Russophobia, repeatedly recognized Pelenski's opinion as erroneous. By the way, Marx hated not only Russians, but almost all Slavs, except Poles, who in his opinion were eternal fighters of the World Revolution, and Marx's friend Engels wrote about Slavs with such hatred and contempt that I'm afraid to quote his statements out loud, because YouTube may confuse them with the thoughts of author of another radical German ideology.
I'll quote a Ukrainian doctor of historical sciences, Yaroslav Dashkevich. Muscovits essentially appropriated the name Rus. This gave it, albeit fake, but still the brilliance of cultural, civilized state with an ancient historical tradition with Byzantine Kiev church metrics.
Dashkevich indeed was a professional historian and researcher, but of the history of the East, not Ukraine. Meanwhile, Dashkevich's book How Muscovy Appropriated Kievan Rus is total bunk from a historical research standpoint. In this book, Dashkevich exposes a fringe theory about the Finno-Ugric origins of Russians, deliberately suppresses and distorts historical facts and documents, as well as making the dumbest mistakes with the dates. But the funniest thing is that the author of the video seriously uses this propagandist fiction as an assertive historical source. So, for example, he cites as a historical fact a non-existent commission at the time of Catherine II.
Muscovites were really busy rewriting history, as so to destroy evidence that contradicts the narrative and to fabricate new one that legitimizes it. Catherine the Great, who came after Peter, did exactly that. She created Commission for compiling notes on ancient history, mainly Russian.
I am serious, if you search for the name of the commission on Google, there is nothing but articles from biased Ukrainian websites that support the same narrative as the guy who made this video, and all these sites as one refer to Dashkevich's book.
the sole purpose of which was to attach to a newly rebranded Moscovia a pedigree derived not from Mongols, but from the Norman kings of Rus, Rurik, Helgi Ingvar.
The Russian leaders didn't need to rewrite history to prove that Russia doesn't trace its statehood back to Mongols. It's already obvious if you say that Russia traces its statehood not from Rus, but from the Mongol Empire, then by the same logic you should consider Greece as a heir of Ottoman Empire and Spain as a successor of the Arab Caliphate. And finally, Tim Snyder, one of the most important lobbyists of Ukrainians' interest in Europe, who, like the above-mentioned authors, through historical omissions and forgeries, build a simple picture of the world in front of their supporters about the great civilization of Ukraine and she's a fascist Russia. I don't even need to give any examples because Yaroslav himself demonstrates his historical lectures, bordering on the crossroads of very weak propaganda and elementary literacy.
They stole the name of the medieval state called Rus, and all the subsequent variations of this name. Russia, Russia, Ruthenia, spell however you want it, these are all exonyms stemming from one root, Rus. Exonym means a foreign name that natives don't use. Germany, for example, is an exonym for Deutschland, and Japan is an exonym for Nihon. Russia is a Greek exonym for Rus. Russia and Ruthenia is a Latin exonym for Rus. The theft officially happened in 1721, when Peter the Great renamed the entire state of Moscovia into the Russian Empire. It was not a natural renaming that usually lasts for centuries. It was a deliberate and artificial rebranding. By the will of one person, Muscovites have become Great Russians, Tsar has become an emperor. Listen to a history professor of Yale, Tim Snyder, confirm this rebranding.
The new Russian Empire, as it's called, from 1721, and by the way, Russian Empire is a conscious rebranding exercise, right? It's called Russia because of Rus.
This is simply not true, because since the 15th century there has been a title of the sovereign of all Russia, which denoted the claims of Moscow princes to all the lands of former Rus. The name Muscovy is the exonym which was used by people outside of Russia itself and mainly in Poland. But why did this happen? In many ways, the term Muscovy is a product of Polish propaganda. In the middle of the 13th century, after the Mongol invasion, the weakened lands of Rus became an easy target for foreign invaders. This moment was taken advantage by the Lithuanian princes, who through conquest, threats, bribery and sometimes on voluntary basis annexed vast lands of Rus to their state. Thus formed two centers of unification of the Russian lands. The first was located in Lithuania, which was ruled by a foreign pagan dynasty, which later adopted the Catholic faith, began to oppress the local Orthodox population. The second center was located in Moscow, ruled by the princes of Rurik dynasty, who continued to profess Orthodoxy and preserved it as the main religion of the country and the people. Of course, this situation hasn't been without propaganda. Russian state began to wage a consistent struggle against Lithuania, and later with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the return of Russian lands under the rule of Rurikids. In this situation, the Poles made every effort to challenge the legitimate rights of the descendants of Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise to Kiev, Polotsk and Smolensk. It was the Poles who stubbornly tried to impose on the inhabitants of the European countries the narrative of the Asian Muscovites, contrasting them with the Ruthenians, who lived on land subject to the Polish king. Yaroslav wants to impose on the viewers the idea that before Peter I, absolutely all foreigners called Russian Muscovy, but this, of course, not true. The Venetian diplomat Ambrogio Contarini, returning from Persia, wrote, "On September 12, 1476, we finally entered the Russian land, with the blessing of God, as the first object that presented itself to our eyes as the entrance to it was a small village surrounded by a forest. On the 26th, I finally arrived to the city of Moscow, praising and thanking Almighty God, who had saved me from so many troubles and misfortunes. This city belongs to Grand Duke Ivan, the sovereign of Great and White Russia." Russian monarchs and German emperors' diplomatic contracts were commemorated by Hans Borgmeyer's engraving, Alliance with White Russians, which depicts the meeting of Emperor Maximilian with the Russian ambassadors. The German diplomat Sigismund von Herberstein, who visited the court of Vasily III, left a brief description of Russia and its capital, Muscovy. From the time of Rurik up to the present ruler, these sovereigns used only the title of Grand Dukes, either Vladimir, Moscow or Novgorod, except Ivan Vasilievich, who called himself the Grand Prince of Moscow and all Russia. The current Vasily Ivanovich has appropriated the name title to himself, Great Sovereign Vasily, Tsar and Lord of all Russia, and Grand Duke of Vladimir, Moscow, Novgorod, Pskov, Smolensk. By the way, Yaroslav likes to refer to Wikipedia in his video. He shows an article about the Moscow Principality. Okay, let's follow the logic of Yaroslav himself. Open this article, go down a little lower and see what's written in the name section. In spite of feudalism, the collective name of Eastern Slavic land Rus wasn't forgotten, though it then became a cultural and geographical rather than the political term, as there was no single political entity on the territory. Since the 14th century, various Muscovite princes added Avol Rus to their titles. After the title of Russian metropolitans, the Metropolitan Avol Rus. Dmitry Shemaika was the first Muscovite prince who minted coins with the title the Sovereign of all Rus. Although initially both Sovereign and All Rus was supposed to be rather ironic epithets, since Ivan III is transformed into the political claim over the territory of all the former Kievan Rus, a goal that the Muscovite prince came closer to by the end of that century, uniting Eastern Rus. Such claims raised much opposition and hostility from its main rival, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which controlled a large portion of the land of ancient Rus, and hence denied any claims and even the self-name of the eastern neighbor. Under the Polish-Lithuanian influence, the country began to be called Moscovia in Western Europe. The most interesting, mixed with foreign engravings, Yaroslav shows a small part of the title of the Russian Tsars, in which is written Tsar of Moscow. I bet Yaroslav would be really pissed off if he found out what the actual full Tsar title sounded like. Let's take an example of how the title of Alexei Mikhailovich, who was the father of Peter, sounded. By the grace of God, we, the great sovereign Tsar and Grand Duke Alexei Mikhailovich of all great and small and wide Russia, Autocrat of Moscow, Kiev, Vladimir, Novgorod.
Together with the name Rus, they have appropriated the history of Rus, its culture, its prestige, as Rus was once a great empire on par with Byzantine one, while Muscovy didn't even exist. If we look at Moscovia's origin, we see that it was born as a vassal to the Golden Horde.
It's not very clear what's the meaning of the reproach that the author makes against Moscow. At the end of the 15th century, all the other principalities also recognized the power of the Golden Horde over themselves, because they had no other choice. But it was the Moscow princes who most often demonstrated disobedience to the Huns. The founder of Moscow Principality, Daniel I, being the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, and occupying not the highest place in the princely hierarchy, behaved very boldly and decisively. In the autumn of 1300, Daniel defeated the army of Prince Constantine of Ryazan and the Horde detachment accompanying this army. Daniel's eldest son Yuri in 1321, having beaten out tribute from the sons of Mikhail Tversky, didn't transfer it to the Horde ambassador, but instead left for Novgorod, apparently planning to dispose of the money received in his own interests. At the same time, Rus was in vassalage dependence of the Horde, and such an act was quite brave. After the murder of Yuri by Dmitry Mikhailovich in the Horde, Ivan Kalita came to power in Moscow, who, unlike his predecessors, really demonstrated full loyalty to the Horde. But did he have any other choice? Kalita's reign fell at a time when Uzbek Khan consolidated his power in the Horde. Obviously, it was possible to try to weaken the dependence of the Horde only by waiting for the Horde to weaken, as this was later used by Dmitry Donskoy, who, having gathered troops from all Russian principalities, inflicted a serious defeat on the Horde from Rus, which led to a huge patriotic and religious upsurge in the territory of all Russian principalities. Donskoy was greeted from the battlefield as a national hero. The final liberation from the Horde occurred in 1480. By standing on the Ugra River. 8 years before that, in 1472, Ivan III finally curtailed the payment of tribute to the Great Horde.
And paid tribute to them until the very 1700s. So just some 300-ish years ago, there was no Russia. There was Moscovia paying its last tribute to the Crimean Khanate.
This small passage requires a lot of detailed analysis. Yaroslav says that Russia paid tribute to the Crimean Khanate up to the 17th century without specifying any details. In fact, the payment of tribute by Moscow to the Horde ended back in 1472 under Ivan III. So what does Yaroslav mean? He means the so-called pominki. These were relatively regular payments of gifts, which the Crimean Khans for their part perceived as a continuation of the payment of tribute. Not only Russian monarchs paid for the pominki, but also Lithuanian princes and Polish kings. In the case of relations between Crimea and Moscow, the pominki was first mentioned in 1474, when the union of Ivan III and Mongol was concluded. The Russian side ensured that information about the paid pominki wasn't included in the contract itself. At the same time, Lithuanian Prince Casimir IV also pays the pominki to the Crimean Khan. Later, the Moscow princes and Tsars successfully avoided the legal formalization for obligations to pay pominki in contracts with the Crimean Khans. Because of this, the size of pominki was uncertain, changing over time. as a payment could stop for quite significant periods of time, especially during the Russian-Crimean conflicts. But in case of Lithuania and Poland, the situation with the Paminki was even worse. Prince of Lithuania and King of Poland Sigismund III in 1530 pledged to pay the Paminki to Mengli-Girai. That is, the payments of Paminki from Lithuania and Poland were of a formal nature, which the Crimean Tatars couldn't achieve from the Moscow for a long time. The official legal registration of the Paminki by Moscow took place during the Troubles, when Russia's very existence was under the threat and Moscow had to make concessions to Crimea in order to secure its southern borders. Finally, the Paminki ceased to be paid by the Russian Tsardom and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the same time after the signing of eternal peace between these two countries in 1686. The Paminki was a form of economic, but most importantly not political dependence on the Crimean Khanate. For example, at the beginning of the 19th century, the United States was in the same dependence, paying tribute to the Barbary pirates, and the US paying this tribute until the defeat of the pirates in 1815.
Moscovia denies Ukraine exists. In its imperial self-destroying hatred, they are doubling down on Ukrainians, destroying our memorials, cancelling our language, burning our books. Destroying our memorials, cancelling our language, burning our books.
Symbols, the name of which Yaroslav doesn't pronounce, used not only in the heraldry of Ukraine. The same symbolism is depicted on the flag and coat of arms of Staraya Ladoga, the city where Rurik's squad arrived after the Novgorodians invited the Varangians to Rus. But I think it's obvious to everyone that for most, the symbol in this interpretation is associated with the Ukrainian state and not with the old Russian dynasty, so these claims from Yaroslav look very strange.
When the Mongol invasion destroyed Rus and burned Kiev in 1240, western part of Rus persevered, and on Wikipedia, this western part of Rus is called Kingdom of Galicia-Volyn.
No, Mongolia didn't destroy Rus. At this moment, Yaroslav specifically replaces the concepts. Mongols have left an indelible mark on the Russian principalities in the form of population decline and destroyed cities, but at the same time the Russian principalities existed before the Mongol invasion and continued to exist after. They just fell into vassalage. The Galicia-Volyn Principality fell into exactly the same vassalage from the Mongols, and in 1259 the Galician-Volyn army, together with a horde, took a campaign against Poland and Lithuania. Galicia also was plundered and burned during the Mongol invasion, just like the rest of the cities of Rus. Therefore, it's absolutely unclear what the author means when he speaks of the Galician-Volyn Principality as the last stronghold of Rus, which the Mongols couldn't destroy.
I think I came up with a good analogy to illustrate the situation around the stolen name. There was a province of Britain within the Roman Empire, where Londinium arose. The same way there was province of Vladimir-Suzdal within Rus, where Moscovia arose. Both of those provinces were conquered and were paying tributes to their capital, one to Rome, another one to Kiev. Needless to say, both of them had completely different ethnic people living there.
In this passage, Yaroslav uses a misleading analogy to portray the Vladimir-Suzdal Principality as a periphery and outskirts of Kievan Rus. Actually, that's not true at all. After the start of fragmentation in ancient Rus, 9 Russian lands were assigned to separate branches of the Rurik dynasty. As the throne in Novgorod and Kiev became common and different princes could claim, that's why northeastern Rus, represented by Vladimir-Suzdal, and later the Moscow Principality, had exactly the same legitimate rights to unify Russian lands and succeed Kievan Rus as a southwestern Rus, represented by Galician-Volyn Principality. In addition, one of the main arguments in favor of the succession of Moscow from Kievan Rus is spiritual heredity. In 1299, Metropolitan Maxim moved his cathedra or department from Kiev to Vladimir. It was an incredibly important event that increased the already high authority of the Vladimir-Suzdal land, primarily for all Eastern Slavs, because the religious identity in the Middle Ages was much stronger than the national identity. And in 1325, Metropolitan Peter of Vladimir moved his department to Moscow. If we are to draw analogies, the Northern Rus is Prussia or Sardinia, which united a fragmented state under the rule of a single center.
Meanwhile, 1,000 kilometers from Kingdom of Rus, there is a country that's undeniably called Moscovia, that is minting coins with Arabic script on them.
Yaroslav, let's play a game. Look, this is another coin with a disgusting Arabic script. Now try to guess what prince it belongs to. Maybe Asian Moscovites, isn't it? Oh, how is that? If anyone doesn't know, this coin is one of the first East Slavic princes, Svyatoslav Igorevich. Hey Yaroslav, when will the new video about the Asian and non-Slavic essence of Kievan Rus be released?
That is minting coins with Arabic script on them, and that Tsars wear hats with Koran scriptures. Yaroslav Pelenski from Harvard Ukrainian Studies in the 80s released his work where he states that people just believed them. Muscovy's assertions that it succeeded to Kiev by right of inheritance were accepted by a large number of historians as a matter of fact, beyond the limits of permissible inquiry and critical examination.
And again, the author refers to an obviously biased Ukrainophile and Russophile from Warsaw. Out of the whole 33 minutes of this video, there is only one relatively neutral source. We will come back to it a bit later.
We are the direct descendants of Ruthenian people who lived in Rus. We are not nomadic people like Turks or Hungarians that came to new territories. Despite Moscow's colossal efforts to assimilate us, we still preserve a lot of Russian identity.
Yaroslav obviously won't tell you that pro-Russian sentiments were very strong among the Ruthenians.
Our coat of arms, the Trident, is the family crest of Russian ruler Vladimir the Great. Our currency is named Hryvna, the same name of a currency that was in Rus. Fun fact, ruble means a chunk of Hryvna, from the word rubate, which means to cut. So if you cut Hryvna, you get rubles.
Even more interesting fact, Hryvna was adopted as a national currency of Ukraine only in the 20th century.
The Ukrainian classic look involving one earring, a unique haircut called oseledets, and big mustache dates all the way back to Russian ruler Svyatoslav, and Ukrainian Cossacks look just like him.
At this moment, Yaroslav uses one of the most stupid and illiterate manipulations in this video, comparing the appearance of Svyatoslav Igorevich from the 10th century and the appearance of the Zaporozhian Cossacks from the 16th century. I mean, there is a difference of half a millennium between them. If you're interested to know why Prince Svyatoslav had such an unusual appearance for the princes of ancient Rus, then there is no definite answer to this question, but there are several versions. The first version is that Svyatoslav most likely borrowed a traditional Turkic hairstyle, Aydar, since Rus during his reign bordered on a huge number of diverse Turkic peoples, Khazars, Avars and Bulgars. However, there is a second, more boring statement. The only source that describes Svyatoslav's appearance is the chronicle of the Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon. The Deacon himself wasn't an eyewitness to the negotiations with Svyatoslav. It is possible that he could copy the description of Svyatoslav's appearance from the description of Attila's appearance, since he considered this East Slavic prince to be another barbarian. Therefore, even if Svyatoslav Igorevich had such a hairstyle, it had a clear Asian and non-Slavic origin. Agree, it turns out a little strange. The Khazar hairstyle, the Arabic script on the coins. Probably if Svyatoslav had been born 300 years later and had become a prince in Moscow, Yaroslav would have been happy to call him a non-Slavic Finno-Turkic Asian Muscovy. By the way, like Svyatoslav, the Zaporozhian Cossacks also borrowed their appearance from Asians. Right now I'm showing you the coats of arms in many countries in Southern and Eastern Europe that have a character with a so-called oseledets on his head. And that's not a Zaporozhian Cossack at all, it's a Turk.
And Ukrainian Cossacks look just like him. Compare that to any Muscovy ruler, Ivan the Terrible for example, completely different. And actually, we also have some people identifying themselves as Ruthenians living in Ukraine, majority of them being beyond the Carpathian Mountains. So most likely, the natural renaming didn't reach them in isolation.
Yaroslav has a very funny attitude towards Rusyns. He literally treats them as isolated savages who simply don't know that they are actually Ukrainians. No, man, if you think that Ukrainians are separate people from Russians, then by exactly the same logic you should consider that Rusyns separate people from Ukrainians, since they managed to preserve their original language and culture despite the total Ukrainization in Soviet and independent Ukraine.
Nobody knows what Ukraine means exactly, but the most prominent theory is that it means inland, a sort of homeland. UNV means in. That's why on some maps that we are about to see, you will see Ukraine spelled through the V, Ukraina. The remaining part, Kraina, means country.
As far as I understand, according to Yaroslav's logic, this Latin inscription on the Spanish coat of arms doesn't really read as plus ultra, but as Pelaves Veltra.
The word Ukraine was first mentioned in the 12th century Kiev Chronicle in the context of original ruler dying and that Ukraine was mourning him a lot.
It's true, but by Ukraine in this text means the outskirts of the lands of Yaroslav Principality. By the way, Yaroslav mentioned the Ipativ Chronicle as a source. So let's look at it in a little more detail. Maybe there are mentions of Ukraine in it? And yeah, there is. And again in the context of the outskirts. It's worth noting that during the time of Kievan Rus, the word Ukraine didn't have a specific territorial meaning. Therefore there were dozens of these Ukraines. The modern Ukraine got its name from the lands along the Dnieper River, which for a long time were the outskirts of Poland-Lithuania. The border in Polish is Krai, hence Ukraina. It's like a province located at the ends of the kingdom. And there is nothing humiliating or insulting in this. For example, the name of the Baltic Galinda tribe comes from a word meaning outskirts, or the name of the Mercia region comes from the Old English word merg, which translates as a boundary, while also the name of the country Denmark, which translates as a borderland of Danes.
Let's check out the old maps.
Oh, that's one of the funniest parts of this video. Yaroslav chooses only those maps that are beneficial for his propaganda narrative, and apparently considering his viewing is blind, and specifically ignores fragments of maps where the territories of the Moscow Principality are marked with the word Russia.
1595 Germanic map, and we see Moscovia, and then where there is Leopolis we see Russia, right? And then we see Kiev. 1595 Germanic map, and we see Moscovia, Moscovia, Moscovia. So instantly we land on the map, 1690, made in Amsterdam, and we see Moscovia.
The name Moscovia and the name Russia are used on this map. As we mentioned earlier, foreigners call this state both. At the same time, it's easy to notice that Moscovia occupies only a small part of the territory of Russia, and rather designates one of the regions than the whole country. Here are some more maps that use terms Russia and Muscovy as absolute synonymous for the same state. I think it's more than enough to refute Yaroslav's thesis, because as he said himself,
lastly, I would like to address the preposterous title of Moscow Tsars, as they had self-proclaimed themselves to be Tsars of all Russia.
Yaroslav is not trying to expose the title Sovereign of all Russia, which totally contradicts his claim from the start of this video, where he says Peter the Great renamed Moscovia.
The theft officially happened in 1721, when Peter the Great renamed the entire state of Moscovia into the Russian Empire.
Anyway, let's look at his arguments.
Best way to refute that would be to read from Antonius Posavini work, The Moscovia, from 1587. If we go to the page 61 and zoom in, Grand Princes of Muscovy refer to themselves as lords of all Russia, even though much of what they call Russia is in the hands of a Polish king.
Guys, let me show you a map of Kievan Rus and compare it with the borders of the Russian Tsardom and the Poland-Lithuania during the reign of Ivan the Terrible, so we can compare who controlled more lands. Fortunately, unlike Posavina, who lived in 16th century, now we have such an opportunity.
Ivan, when writing to the Turks, on occasion ordered himself called Emperor of Germany as well. When coveting Livonia and casting an eye on Prussia, Ivan claimed that he was descended from a brother of Augustus Caesar.
Just as always, it's completely unclear what Yaroslav wanted to prove with this quote. Such statements by Ivan the Terrible were only a confirmation of his bold ambitions during the Livonian War. Even if his title eventually had been supplemented, it would make absolutely no difference, because Ivan was first of all the sovereign of all Russia, just as Napoleon was first of all the emperor of the French, and Victoria was first of all the queen of the United Kingdom.
While it was common for kings to put in their titles the name of lands, territories they have conquered, for example, name Russia was also in the titles of Polish, Hungarian, Lithuanian kings, title alone does not give them any right to claim the name Russia.
Yaroslav is drawing yet another completely inappropriate analogy. Yes, Yagailo, August Frederick, and John Casimir couldn't inherit Kievan Rus, because they were representatives of another dynasty and rulers of completely another state and country. This can't be attributed in any way to Moscow princes, since they were not foreign invaders who later assimilated with the local population, such as Lithuania, for example. The lands of this principality before fragmentation were the territories of Kievan Rus, and the Moscow Principality was founded by the Rurikids.
Why does it matter if Moscovia falsely claims to be a Rus successor? I mean, there's Wallachia calling itself as Romania, directly deriving its name from the Roman Empire.
Going back to Pesavina book, there is stuff that Yaroslav would definitely not appreciate. For example, Pesavina, like many other authors of that time, spreads the name Moscovits to all Eastern Slavs, writing about Prince Vladimir of Moscow. The best way to explain the situation was another foreigner, the French mercenary Jacques Margaret, who wrote the book The Russian State and the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. Russians have been called Moscovites for some time now. After they threw off the yoke of Tatars, as the Christian world learned something about them. Moscow, which bears the princely title, not the only one in the country, since the sovereign was once called the Grand Duke of Vladimir. Therefore mistaken to call them Muscovites, not Russians, as not only we who live far away do, but also their closer neighbors. When asked which nation they belong to, they answer Russians. And if asked from where, they answer from Moscow, Vologda, Ryazan and other cities. And concluding this video, I can't help but note Yaroslav's obvious Russophobia. I don't like to put labels, especially the label of any phobia, when it's unreasonable, but here it's more than obvious.
Muscovites are expert in deceptions and lies. The point I want to make is that Muscovites are systematic liars. Lying is the core attribute of Muscovites. It's their foundation. Current Russia, on the other hand, is not keeping the past behind. It's not moving on. And not because they don't want to. It's because they can't. Expansion of their empire, lies, meddling in others' affairs, serfdom and puppeteering, disregard for individualism and human rights is the very foundation of their very existence from their very birth as a slave within the Mongol Horde. That's why they invaded Ukraine, to preserve themselves, while being the richest country on earth in terms of natural resources, while having the most amazing opportunities to prosper and grow. They are acting right now in a self-destructing ways, because they just can't act otherwise. Acting otherwise would imply them being democratic. Them respecting international law. Upholding human rights. Which would be acting against their fundamental core. That would mean letting go dozens of nations they have conquered. Chechnya, Dagestan, Siberia, Sakha, Buryatia, and so on. That would mean to return Karelia to Finland, Kuban and Crimea to Ukraine, Amur to China, Smolensk to Belarus.
Using the example of Yaroslav, we saw how, hiding behind the good intentions of fighting propaganda, these people, using manipulations, forgery, minor mistakes and lies, are trying to create a picture of history that is beneficial primarily to themselves. Your like and subscription will be the best support for me. Thanks for watching.
My name is Yaroslav.